Welcome to another edition of Chargers Unleashed. Jake Hefner and Dan Wolkenstein here with you from the LA Football Network. If this is your first time tuning into the show, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Dan Wolkenstein, much like we did last week, talking about the differences of the coaching culture now that we have Jim Harbaugh in place, and you compare that to previous head coaching regimes as we went through the Brandon Staley days, as we went through the Anthony Lynn days, and the impact that Jim Harbaugh had in just a short time without even playing a single regular season game and what he is doing for this Chargers team thus far. We're going to take that same type of argument, and now we're going to put it into the comparison between new Chargers general manager Joe Hortiz and former Chargers GM Tom Telesco. This should be an interesting conversation. Before we get into it, Dan Wolkenstein, how are you, sir?
I'm well, thank you. Still recovering from the sunburn, but I'm feeling a little bit better today. How are you? How's the weekend?
Have you been dousing in aloe?
Yes, I think the lotion I'm using has aloe in it, but a little dusty. So whenever I meet people that give me a nice little hug and scratch the back, I'm like, oh, thank you. Anyways, how are you?
Fantastic, man. It's another week that we're closer to training camp, another week that we're closer to football. These type of conversations, especially the one that we're about to have today, this is what gets us through it.
Yes, and I think it's always fun. We talk about perspective a lot on this show, and for good reason, because there's always hype, right? When new things happen, and there's hope and excitement building for kind of the new regime. But in the case of what we saw previously in the last episode, we talked about the head coaching differences. Similar with the GM side of things, there's a reason why almost unanimously, nationally and locally, folks were praising the GM hire of Joe Hortiz. And then when you compare and contrast how he does things, how he's done things so far here in LA in just one offseason, and how things have been done in Baltimore since he's been there and what he's been kind of responsible for, you can understand why there's the finally seeing the light moment for lots of Chargers fans and people covering the team. So this is an interesting perspective episode of the upgrade at general manager and some of the downfalls maybe of the previous regime, how that impacted the team, and what we're looking to see, what we've already started to see from new general manager Joe Hortiz. So to set the stage, Jake, let's pay the bills first. Let's talk about our friends over at BetOnline.
Want to remind everybody that BetOnline remains your number one source for all of your summer sports this season, including baseball, golf, and the NHL playoffs. Game 7 tonight. All the latest stats, news, and scores available for you to follow for all of your favorite teams. Get the latest odds and lines, including the latest team matchups, player props, and odds for just about every sport that is out there. Head on over to the website today. That's betonline.ag. Use the promo code UNLEASHED, or use your mobile device to get in on the action. Going over to BetOnline, where the game starts.
So, Jake, I kind of put the visual here right at the beginning, and I think it kind of goes without saying, but I would say 99% of Chargers fans and people covering the team would acknowledge that the new general manager, Joe Hortiz, is an upgrade over previous general manager, Tom Telesco. And there are probably a million reasons why people believe that. But what we're going to try to do is try to disseminate, some of all of that and kind of get to the nitty gritty of what actually makes this an upgrade. And so to kind of, I guess, kick off the discussion, in your eyes, if you just look at the overarching general manager role, what is the job of a general manager? Like if you gave him, I don't know, 3 to 5 bullets of the things that he must do to be successful, what would you say those are?
Roster construction, collaboration with the head coach on how to formidably build a team. That would be where I would start. And then, of course, when it comes to free agency, you make the tough decisions on the ones that you're either going to sign, extend, or make the choice that you have to part with.
Yeah, I honestly, all three of those perfect. I would probably say, adjusting on the fly is probably up there too, with
Sure.
being able to, manage things as they come.
In
And
season, off
also
season moves.
project future and making sure that you are in a position to succeed both short
Yes.
term and long term. So that's the role of a general manager. And ultimately, at the end of the day, win Super Bowls, right? So let's kind of go through these two. And what we're going to do is we'll start off with Tom Telesco, what he did with his tenure here in Los Angeles / San Diego. Then we'll go through Joe Hortiz and kind of what he was bringing from Baltimore, and then what Joe Hortiz is doing here so far in LA, and compare and contrast the two and why folks see this and why we see this as a huge upgrade and why the Chargers are set up to succeed both short term and long term with Joe Hortiz and Jim Harbaugh at the helm. So without further ado, Jake, let's get this thing started. Tom Telesco was the general manager for quite some time, Jake, and I would imagine people have their gripes for Tom Telesco for many reasons. And in my opinion, and I'll kind of let you take this how you want, but the downfall that I saw with Tom Telesco, just off the top here, there was a lot of in-season, I'll call it rigidness, where there was almost this refusal to have any in-season acquisitions or free agent acquisitions during the season or after a certain point. It was like, all right, here's what we got. Go do it. I did what you needed to do, coach. Now it's your job. There were the other pillar, I would say, was kind of the underbelly failures of the roster, which we saw kind of the big ticket signings, and then everything else kind of fell through. We'll talk about all these in more detail, but I'm kind of just giving the overview here. The questionable either signing or re-signing of players. So, re-signing some players to top-end contracts, like a Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Joey Bosa, all of which, if we're facing it, kind of have some injury asterisks nearby. And these are big ticket contracts. But then letting go of players like Drew Tranquil or Kaiser White or Adrian Phillips or Chenan Nwosu. Weird. And then probably the other one is just and this is kind of the nuance to being a general manager, Jake, but something that you see in Baltimore that I think is really important, and we didn't see this in the Chargers land at all, was getting more at bats at the plate during the draft. And immediately, we'll get to it with Joe Hortiz, but the whole comp formula thing and trading back and trading up and having more draft selections to go out and get players. Tom Telesco just didn't do it. He just would not do it. And I remember for years, Jake was just clamoring, please just give me a trade
I'm
back.
Still clamoring for it. Thought I was going to get it this year. I still didn't get it this year. I'm still waiting.
And so I guess I'll stop there. Those are some of the big things that came top of mind to me of and all of that came to a head when you start seeing it happen in season, right? You see players start getting injured and then the underbelly of the roster not working out. And then the season progresses and there aren't any free agents that are being brought in season, no trades happening. And then the ship just continues to sink and they just kind of watch it happen. Granted, there were some successful seasons, quote unquote, but there wasn't this steady rise. It felt like a bunch of ebbs and flows throughout, and there was no consistency. Hence why you saw so many different coaching changes. And so there was a lot of fluctuation, and a lot of that I would probably just pin on, to your point, a lack of consistent and collective vision from top down.
Agreed.
And you can define what the top is and what the down is, but the lack of shared vision to me was just something that seemed to have plagued Tom Telesco in his tenure.
Yeah, no question about that, Dan. And I fully agree with everything that you said. I think that all of that is however you would want to phrase it, in a nutshell, that those are some of the many issues that took place with Tom Telesco. Now, you go back to 2013 when he was first brought in with this team. This was the Chargers finally moving on from the A.J. Smith era. And in comparison with that, there are some things that Tom Telesco actually did that I favor over A.J. Smith. Now, everybody knows A.J. Smith from his early 2000 days with the Chargers and the players that he was able to acquire in those first couple rounds, and obviously most famously the Phillip Rivers, Eli Manning trade, and everybody was all over him for that, and that ended up building out a very nice team throughout that, call it early part of the decade. We also remember A.J. Smith as the guy who fired Marty Schottenheimer after a 14-2 season in 2006. And Wade Phillips was part of that organization, and Cam Cameron was part of that organization, and essentially just did a complete overhaul on the head coaching staff.
And real quick, sidebar. 14-2, fired. And then contrast that with the Jacksonville collapse and retained.
There you go. It's a nice little teaser into it. So Tom Telesco was brought in after 12 years of being with the Colts. And much like Joe Hortiz, he worked his way up from an area scout to director of player personnel to VP of player personnel while he was there. And he got his opportunity from the Spanoses to come in and be the Chargers GM. I've written down so many things here, Dan, because this was the idea that Tom Telesco was coming in with, that they were going to build through the draft. That was how he was mentored in Indy. This was going to be a new way to shape the Chargers. And you thought in doing this that this would ultimately end up making the Chargers not only more talented, because, goodness, you look at just some of those drafts before Tom Telesco arrived. 2012, Melvin Ingram, Kendall Reyes, Brandon Taylor, Ladarius Green, Johnny Troutman, David Malk, and Edward Baker.
Who?
Exactly. Even before that, one of my favorites, one of the few times that the Chargers have ever had 2 second-round picks, it was Corey Liuget. Then it was Marcus Gilchrist, and one of my favorites, Jonas Mouton. So the drafting in the later part of the 2000s did not favor the Chargers. So that's why everybody got excited about Tom Telesco coming in the first place, and with this whole idea that he wanted to build and prioritize through the draft.
Build and prioritize through the draft.
In hindsight, 2020, and looking at this now, I don't know what Tom Telesco was prioritizing in a number of these different picks. Let's start in his first draft in 2013. DJ Fluker, Manti Te'o, Keenan Allen, Steve Williams, Torek Williams, and Brad Sorensen. I want to focus in on the DJ Fluker one for a second, because I want you to remember this time frame. We talk about the days of Phillip Rivers and the offensive line struggles that he had to deal with throughout his career. And now that the Chargers have Justin Herbert, they're finally starting to invest in that offensive line a little bit more. When DJ Fluker was selected in 2013, Dan, the Chargers drafted a couple other offensive linemen in that duration. Forrest Lamp, Dan Feeney. I remember how excited people were about both of those selections, especially since Forrest Lamp was projected at that time to be a first-round pick, and people were stoked that the Chargers got him in the second round. Chris Watt was a third-round selection. The point I'm trying to make here with this, Dan, is that those were all three interior offensive linemen. The Chargers did not put a priority on either a left tackle or a right tackle that high from DJ Fluker until Rashawn Slater was drafted.
Which is insane.
To think about the other tackles that you actually had in there in that time, Sam Tevy at one time was a starting tackle for you on the right side. We know how that worked out. A lot of the other acquisitions were free agent busts, essentially. Orlando Franklin ended up being lumped in there, didn't end up panning out. But the point of the matter is you, and keep in mind, DJ Fluker was a right tackle. You mean to tell me that you did not invest in another tackle position to help your franchise quarterback, whether that was Phillip Rivers or Justin Herbert, until 8 years later? Dan, I know this one gets you. When Jason Verrett was selected in the first round of the 2014 draft.
That was the last time.
The last time that the Chargers had put that high priority on a cornerback until they signed Asante Samuel Jr. in the second round in 2021. In between that, let's look. Craig Mager, that was a fantastic signing in 2015. One of the early third round blunders of Tom Telesco's tenure. As I'm going through here, there was no corner selected in 2016. There was no corner selected in 2017. There was no corner selected in 2018. You got some safeties. He drafted he drafted 2 safeties in 2017.
To not cry right now.
Technically, Desmond King, who was a safety, ended up being a corner, so I guess you could say that. Right. The fifth round, Rashawn Jenkins was taken right before him as a safety. Kaiser White, who technically was a safety in college, but ended up being a converted linebacker. There was no corner or safety, for that matter, taken in 2019. And the next secondary priority that you put on the Chargers at that point in time was Alohi Gilman when he was selected in the 6th round in 2020.
Which panned out, and that turned out great, but come on.
That amount of time to not put that high priority on a corner is outrageous. Now, I'll give Tom Telesco this. Probably the best free agent acquisition that he signed that actually gave a great return on investment was Casey Hayward.
Yes.
That's about it.
The last homegrown corner I can remember was what? Quentin? Was Jammer the last one?
Probably the one that panned out with the most consistency.
Or Cromartie, I guess. Those would be the two.
I mean, Cromartie had his 10 interception season, but then he dropped off.
Totally.
Quickly.
He got his money.
Quickly after that.
It's interesting you mentioned this. I was just listening to an episode from The Athletic and Robert Mays, and they were talking about, and one of the concerns they had about the Chargers generally was you look at the strengths of the team currently versus maybe strengths of historical teams that are good. And they talk about like the spine of a defense, right? They talk about like the inside. You look at the interior defensive line, you look at the linebackers. The Chargers are built the opposite. Like the edge is good, your safety is good, but the spine on the inside, that has been lacking for years. And you wonder why. Like, go look at the interior defensive line priorities if you want to. You mentioned the offensive line. We talk about Phillip Rivers absolutely getting decimated for how many years, and everyone's saying he would beg to have an offensive line like Justin Herbert has had. And this is just draft selections. This isn't even getting into draft strategy or trading up and down or the rigidity or pairing with somebody who has a similar vision and executing upon that vision, right? Like there's so many things that, and I don't want to harp too much on this because this is why
it all leads to the argument, Dan. You'd mentioned the interior defensive line. When Corey Liuget was taken in 2011 in the first round, no worries. You just waited 8 years before you decided to prioritize another interior defensive lineman in the first round, and that just so happened to be Jerry Tillery, and we know how that ended up panning out. My point here is, and this is going to extend greatly here in just a second. Before I get into if we just talked about in a microcosm the era now with Justin Herbert, think about this for a second.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I was going to say that I enjoyed about Tom Telesco as the GM as opposed to AJ Smith is that AJ Smith was the reason that the notion of the Chargers being cheap and not paying their top end players, he was the reason that those notions were created. Because of his self-belief and his draft savvy at the time, because of what he had done in the days of Phillip Rivers and LT and, pulling off that Eli Manning trade, I felt like, especially even evident with Marty Schottenheimer, that he felt like anybody was expendable and he didn't have to give any big time contracts. That was where that whole notion came from. One thing that Tom Telesco did do is that he did end up kind of putting that notion to bed in terms of paying, his top
I was going to say, like, it's not all bad, right? I know we're sitting here and kind of piling on, but there were things that he did that dispelled some of the long time, I guess, known Chargerisms. So it wasn't all bad.
Correct. Now, the flip side of that is that most of the extensions that he ended up giving out to those players did not end up having the return investment that you want. And here you go a little bit deeper with this, Dan. And this is probably the most damning stat of them all. In the duration of Tom Telesco being the GM of the team, there are only 2 players that were selected outside of the first round, so between rounds 2 and 7, that saw a second contract under Tom Telesco. Let me say that again. From 2013, from the time that Tom Telesco walked the door to the time that he exited it last year, there were 2 players that were selected between rounds 2 and 7 that saw a second contract.
Who's the second one? Keenan's one.
Keenan and Trey Pipkins.
And Trey Pipkins, that was one that everyone was like waiting year after year after year after year.
If that is not damning about the history of your draft selections and what you have built, I understand everything that he had done in the first round, and that was where he got a lot of his notoriety, that when it came to it, first round picks, he was able to do decently with those. But this is probably one of the biggest comparisons between him and Joe Hortiz, is that stat right there. How do you go that long in that duration of selections to where you can't find guys that you're going to keep? One of them's on the screen right now that a lot of people believe that he earned that money.
Yep.
Another one in Drew Tranquil, we believe that he earned that money and didn't get it. There's a number of guys that you could say that you did it, but it also speaks volumes to a number of guys who are no longer on this team because they didn't even last that long. So one way you want to look at it, he's either not paying the guys that ended up producing for other teams, or he's jettisoning guys that just didn't end up panning out for his own. Either way that you look at it, it's not a good look. Now, Dan,
and there are levels to this, though, Jake.
Of course.
Like, this is one of the things that, and we'll get to Joe Hortiz here in a second, but if you're not going to retain your talent, fine. But if you're drafting well, the players that you're not retaining, you should be able to be getting some compensation back in return.
Correct.
So compensatory picks. Maybe people are wanting to trade for your players. That didn't happen for the most part. Like, there were a couple, but like the last one that I can remember that was even remotely respectable was the Phillip Rivers one. And that was kind of like obvious they had to get rid of him because they were going with a younger quarterback and they was going a different direction. Like, there are levels to this. Like, as a GM, right? Like, this is why there's the baseline understanding. All right, I got to draft well. I have to sign players well. I have to make sure that, you know, the team's healthy, shared vision. But then there's like the stuff in the cracks, like the things are the tertiary pieces that go from being a okay GM to a great one, and how you can kind of fill in all those outer edges to give your team the most opportunities to succeed, both on and off the field. And that, in my opinion, that tertiary stuff is where Telesco failed.
Yeah, you talk about the levels to it, Dan. It's cumulative of miss after miss after miss. And whichever way you want to look at it, whether we're talking about free agent signings, extensions, how you draft the players that are still on this team. Now let's just take the Justin Herbert era in a microcosm.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, let's look at this era and who is actually providing meaningful contributions to this team.
Perfect. Let's start with when Justin Herbert was selected in 2020. He and Alohi Gilman are the only two players that are remaining on this roster as it currently stands. And credit to Alohi Gilman because he earned that second contract. But you traded back into the first round for Kenneth Murray in 2020. You didn't have another selection until the fourth round in which you selected Joshua Kelly. Then it was Joe Reed in the fifth round. Then Alohi Gilman came in the sixth, and then you finished off with KJ Hill in the seventh. That was just 4 years ago. Let's take it to the next year. Arguably the best year that he had in this era, Rashawn Slater, Asante Samuel Jr. Now, Asante Samuel Jr. still has question marks on to play. It's not even guaranteed that he's going to see a second contract with this team.
But
Time will tell.
He's providing, though. Like,
he's
that
providing.
is a win. That's a good selection. We'll give
Joshua Palmer, who's now finally going to get an opportunity to be that guy in this offense. Strangely enough, happens when Tom Telesco is no longer with this team. But we understand it. It was Keenan Allen and Mike Williams were ahead of him on the depth chart.
Yep.
Trey McKitty was also in that third round with Joshua Palmer.
So first part, doing okay, which again, like that's Tom Telesco's thing. He's gotten those good high players, right? The Derwin James, the Joey Bosa's, the Mike Williams, the Rashawn Slaters. The first round usually is not the problem. It's the underbelly.
Chris Rumpf, Brendan Hymas, Nick Neiman, Larry Roundtree, Mark Webb. That's who rounded out that draft. So you were able to find some...
There's one player left because probably Chris Rumpf it's going to be tough for him.
Sure. 2022, this is another one that's got a bunch of question marks, Dan. Zion Johnson. Okay. Selected that first round.
And think about who was drafted before, by the way. That pains me. Like who the players were that were available when they went guard. But I digress. Go ahead. Continue.
Yeah, don't bring up the certain cornerback that will not be named. Don't do that to me. Remember, this was also the year that you traded for Khalil Mack, so you didn't have a second round pick. So how do you supplant that? You come back around in the third and you select JT Woods with your third round pick, who still has barely seen the field. Isaiah Spiller in the fourth round, who unfortunately has barely seen the field. Tito, who, when healthy, especially in his rookie year, I thought he looked pretty damn good. Now, unfortunately, especially with the way that the interior defensive line is built right now, how do you supplant that? Would you consider him a starter? I wouldn't necessarily consider him a starter, but I consider him a key rotational piece, especially against the run game. Jamari Sawyer, who stepped in well for when Rashawn Slater went down at left tackle. We thought that there was going to be better production for him when he kicked inside to guard last year, but that didn't end up panning out. Jasir Taylor, Dean Leonard, Xander Horvath. That's how the 2022 year rounded out. And Dan, let's go to this. Quentin Johnston, Thule, who you're not going to hear any argument from me or Dan or I think any Chargers fan to say how excited they are for Thule to be in this system as it currently stands right now. Deion Henley, another third-round pick who probably the one third-round pick outside of what we just saw from Junior Colson that we were really excited about.
Oh, yeah.
Like over the moon about to say, like, hey, that was a great selection. That was good value. Fortunately, last year he didn't end up seeing the playing time. Darius Davis, Jordan McFadden, Scott Matlock, Max Duggan. To me, this draft is still incomplete because there's a lot of things that still need to be seen from this group collectively. I think Thule is obviously the standout of it, and that makes perfect sense. And that was the last draft that Tom Telesco had under his belt. And that was just in the span of 4 years under the Justin Herbert regime. It's tough to gauge this because I know that there is a much bigger sample size to measure against Tom Telesco than there is Joe Hortiz. And to Tom Telesco's credit, when you have a quarterback that is playing as good as Justin Herbert is, you do what you can under that rookie contract when you have a quarterback in that point of his career. So you threw out a bunch of money to free agents like Sebastian Joseph Day and Austin Johnson and J.C. Jackson. But much like those other free agent deals that he threw in the years before, just did not end up panning out. Now, you could say it from a standpoint of bad personnel decision or how these players were utilized in the coaching scheme. But Dan, we just talked about it. Accumulation, miss after miss after miss at multiple levels of the GM responsibility. That in total is what led us to Joe Hortiz basically inheriting the Chargers, who were $46 million over the cap space because of all the constant extensions and the bad free agent signings. Joe Hortiz walked through the door and he had a lot to clean up.
And one component that we haven't discussed here that I think is vital, we talked about kind of that lack of shared vision, Jake, and I again, we're going through the details. We're going through these details because this is important to, I kind of feel like holding ourselves and the new management and the whole new franchise kind of accountable, right? And to keep in mind what's important and what matters. Now, Joe Hortiz wasn't the GM in Baltimore, but we talked about consistency. We talked about kind of leadership and organizational structure in previous episodes multiple times. And what the other component of being a successful GM is who you have on your staff, who you're choosing to be selected as your head coach. In Baltimore, again, we're talking about when we went through who we wanted as possible candidates for the Chargers, we went through all of the different franchises that had consistent success, consistent leadership, consistent creativity, right? We talked about Kansas City. We talked about Philly. We talked about Baltimore, Dallas, a little bit there from McClay, Will McClay. Jake, since Joe Hortiz was there, I'm just going to snap the line to 2008. That's when John Harbaugh was there. How many coaches have been there since John Harbaugh? 0. It's been John Harbaugh the entire time. Since 2008, Jake, the Chargers have had Norv Turner, Mike McCoy, Anthony Lynn, Brandon Staley, and now Jim Harbaugh. That's not even counting the interim head coaches that have been brought in or kept for the remainder of the season when these guys get fired. And for Tom Telesco's sake, who he's selecting as Chargers head coaches, again, we're looking at just his tenure, Mike McCoy, Anthony Lynn, Brandon Staley. All 3 first-time head coaches. All 3 very different. So what consistent themes are you seeing? We talked about that's what he has lacked was consistency and a consistent vision. It felt like ping-ponging. All right, this didn't work. Mike McCoy, that certainly didn't work. I'm going to go Anthony Lynn. Anthony Lynn, very different, right? We went through all the coaching stuff before, but going from Norv Turner to Mike McCoy to Anthony Lynn to Brandon Staley, I can't think of 4 more different head coaches. And how can those possibly have a shared vision with Tom Telesco? What is the vision then? I don't know. Baltimore with Joe Hortiz, one stop. Joe Hortiz, Eric DaCosta, Greg, like that lineage matters.
I look at because obviously the first head coach that Tom Telesco brought in under his first year as a GM was Mike McCoy. Mike McCoy was kind of like the shiny new toy because he had done wonders with Tim Tebow and Peyton Manning, and you went off of that at the time to say like, okay, look at what they're creating. I want that with my offense. I kind of felt like it was similar to Brandon Staley because he was the hot shot, young and upcoming coordinator on the opposite side with a defensive mind, which the Chargers obviously needed some focus on. But I also think that that was a little bit overshadowed by who the Rams had, because we're talking about
Personnel.
Aaron Donald, who is going to make up for a lot on a defense, and a number of other key contributors on that defense that were there.
Yep.
I think that those are maybe the only two similarities that you could say in terms of reasonings for what Tom Telesco and the organization did. They reached for the low-hanging fruit that was right there in your face to say, hey, this guy coached up one of the best defenses in the league. Let's go get him.
Yeah, the only consistency, like, and again, I'm not trying to pile on or be disrespectful, but the only consistencies that come to mind from Tom Telesco were either inconsistencies or things that aren't great, things that should not be consistent. So in comes Joe Hortiz. And we've talked about when Joe Hortiz was hired, all of the things that excited us about, at the time, Director of Player Personnel, Joe Hortiz, right? We talked about how he is kind of their savant model of consistency in terms of being in the same place for decades. The Baltimore organization, he's able to learn from some of the greats, Ozzie Newsome, Eric DaCosta. He was able to kind of go up the ranks there, and that's where he wanted to be. He sees what a good head coach looks like. He sees what a successful organization looks like. He sees what a creative GM looks like, and go back and look at some of the trades and some of the numbers of sheer volume of selections that Baltimore has had throughout the years. It's pretty wild. Looking at, this is an interesting stat. We were talking to Jason Ballier he does our other episode for Blueprints. Since 2018, this is going into the draft this year, the Chargers had 44 draft selections. In that same time frame, Baltimore had 11 more selections than the Chargers did at 55. Imagine being a GM knowing that you have 11 more selections than the next one. I mean, that's just like an ace in the hole. That's what competent, creative, forward-thinking GMs do. I'm not even getting to LA Joe Hortiz yet. You look at how Baltimore let go of certain players to bring back compensatory picks. Look at some of the creative trades that they brought in, i.e. Roquan Smith. The Chargers brought in Khalil Mack, but that was an older Khalil Mack. This is a franchise-altering Roquan Smith who could be with them for 5-10 years. That's what has people excited, let alone how great he is at understanding and finding talent at the college level. So that's Joe Hortiz in Baltimore. Before we get to LA Joe Hortiz, Jake, what else about Director of Player Personnel or prior Joe Hortiz are we clamoring for?
I mean, Joe Hortiz spent 26 years with the Baltimore Ravens, learning under two of the best in the business in Ozzie Newsome and Eric DaCosta. And seeing the way that those organizations are run and have been running, Super Bowls have something, speak for themselves. But in terms of how they go about building out the underbelly of the roster with depth, as Dan mentioned, in-season and off-season acquisitions, trading down, getting more swings at the plate. This is how the best teams these days do this. Yes, you're going to have to make some tough decisions. You can't keep everybody. But how are you going to supplant any big-time player that you end up letting go? Whether it's through comp picks or who you end up selecting in place of that, those are just two of the factors in how you do it. In comparison to Tom Telesco, who, yes, signed some of your bigger names that you had on the roster, how did you supplant the rest of the roster? How did you build and prioritize the rest of the roster? You sure as hell don't go 8 years without drafting another tackle. You sure as hell don't go 7 years without putting a high priority on a cornerback from one to the other. That's not doing it properly. That's not building a team that is going to ultimately contend. And yes, one of Tom Telesco's, it was hit or miss, but there were undrafted free agents that he was able to find in that period of time. But if that's what you're relying on through the better part of 10 years outside of the track record of your draft outside of the first round, that ain't going to do it. Joe Hortiz and the Baltimore Ravens have taken a much different approach to that. And the results spoke for themselves during Joe Hortiz's time in Baltimore.
So then the Chargers bring in Joe Hortiz. And again, Joe Hortiz, friends with Harbaugh, worked the Harbaughs for years, obviously. Joe Hortiz, shared vision, Jim Harbaugh, we talked about all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of similarities there. The gel was there. This was the right opportunity for Joe Hortiz. Otherwise, he wasn't going anywhere. He had no need. He was cush. You talked about this as the dream opportunity for him. You talked about what he had to walk into here in Los Angeles with the cap situation. You talked about tough decisions have to be made sometimes. It's not all roses. It's how to navigate that. And I don't want to make this sound like he's this unforsaken hero that the Chargers have never had. You know, bat signal finally answered by Joe Hortiz. But man, it's pretty close considering what this team was up against because of largely the previous regime. The cap situation, talk about tough decisions. He was able to help. I'm sure Jim Harbaugh helped here, along with the staff that was brought in that I guarantee you Joe Hortiz played a part in. And you go look at the sheer size of the staff and the money that's being poured out. You look at the free agent acquisitions that were brought in and the types of deals that were brought in. No ballooning contracts. He actually got players to take a pay cut. Big ticket players. Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack taking less money. Jim Harbaugh was a reason, I'm sure, but the organization, the structure was another reason. And you took that cap situation that they had, what was it, 40-something million? I mean, it was crazy. People were talking
46 million over the cap.
They were talking about it being in cap hell. And in a matter of, I think it was like 3 days when everybody was talking about it. And then it was essentially, you heard about the defensive players, Mack and Bosa taking the pay cut, staying. After you heard about the Michael Williams, Keenan Allen thing, and boom, almost immediately, that was relinquished. And then what do they do with the money? Because then, okay, we have all this money to spend. Maybe we should go out and get all these big ticket free agents. Look at all these guys we can go get. Chargers have done that before. What did that do? J.C. Jackson, how'd that go? He's like, hell no, I ain't doing that. We got to get this team fixed from the ground up. We got the studs in place. Sure, we got Derwin. We've got Justin Herbert. Thule, up-and-coming star. But there are some holes. I mean, we didn't even go into all the damning stats of Chargers over the years with Tom Telesco, whether it's pass protection, run game, secondary, coaching blunders, situational play calling, lack of adjustment, on and on and on and on. We were looking, and I don't have it in front of me, but the number of, and I think it still holds true, the cap number for Keenan Allen, if they were to retain him this year, is more than every single free agent cap number the Chargers have brought in this year. And it's a lot. I think they had over a dozen players they brought in under the cap hit that would have been Keenan Allen. No shade to Keenan Allen. You won't hear a peep about how much we don't like Keenan Allen. He was incredible, arguably one of my top 3 favorite Chargers of all time. Tough decision had to be made. Mike Williams, let go. Talked about the 2 players that took pay cuts. I mean, that's just going into the draft. And then after the draft, it doesn't stop. And it continues. And the types of players they bring in after the draft, and the type of contracts that they bring in pre and post draft, and the type of players they actually draft, Jake. Night and day. Now, again, we're projecting. We don't know. It's incomplete. But the type of player that was drafted this year is different than the types of players that were drafted in years past.
It's because there's a good understanding between head coach and GM on what needs to be done for this team. That's already been established. Batman and Robin, we've heard that type of partnership from day one. When Joe Hortiz walked through the door, that was part of his introductory press conference. Dan, it's also understanding the problem.
So glad you said this.
Understanding the problem. I can remember how many people threw their hands up in excitement when Joe Hortiz said, let's create that cycle of comp picks. How do you do that? You gain as many picks as you can early, and then you draft, develop, and then make smart, keyword, smart decisions on who you re-sign.
Chargers fans had to look up what compensatory picks even were.
What? That's understanding the problem.
And understanding the right problems. Because there are always going to be problems. But does going after problem A result in that much of an improvement in success? That's up to the GM. And a lot of times the problems that Telesco and company went after were the wrong problems to fix.
Now you start looking at the free agency moves that the Joe Hortiz has been part of so far. Re-signed Alohi Gilman, which 100% Alohi Gilman deserved that money. And I'm very glad that they brought him back.
Yeah, honestly,
because it was a 2-year deal for $11 million is what it was. And in retrospect, when you see the contracts that are out there, yes, it looks that way. But Alohi Gilman has been patient. He's developed and has let his play speak for itself, and he earned every bit of that contract. Dan, you look at the rest of the deals, the biggest contract that was actually handed out just in terms of time was the 3-year deal that was given to Will Dissly.
For your quote-unquote blocking tight end.
Understanding the problem that has been non-existent for the Chargers in their tight end room for a number of different years.
One of 2 or 3, according to the coaching staff, tight ends that can own the C gap, i.e. the problem.
Yes. Then you look at the rest of these deals, you just... Hayden Hurst, Denzel Perryman, Gus Edwards, who was a 2-year deal on his, J.K. Dobbins, Bradley Bozeman, Poona Ford, Troy Dye, most recently Tony Jefferson,
Bud Dupree,
thank you.
Christian Fulton.
Also, thank you. There's a number of different names that I just listed off that we would be clamoring for the old regime to say, take a flare on this guy. Do it. Never ended up happening.
Yeah, risk reward, right? Like you weigh the risk reward factor, and a lot of times from the Chargers perspective, the risk and the reward were both like way up there. High risk, sure, but maybe you get a good reward, right? Look at the Brian Bulaga signing. Paid a lot for that. High risk, pay a lot of money, but the reward could be good. JC Jackson, high risk, high reward potential. But the risk, you got burned. And even look, these are great players, but look at the contract values and the production risk reward of Joey Bosa. Look at the reward that you've gotten for the money you've spent. And you tell me if you believe that has been worth it so far. Again, all of these players that Jake is talking about, 2024 cap hit, all combined, less than what Keenan Allen would be getting paid if he stayed with the Chargers.
And to Dan's point, I'm not saying that that was the right move or the wrong move because you can't equate that properly because we haven't seen these new players obviously play. And I remember where I was the day that Keenan Allen was let go.
Me too.
I was on here with Dan. I remember the emotional output that everybody was putting out, considering that Keenan Allen had just been traded to the Chicago Bears. I had a glass of bourbon on this show, and it was well deserved when we were going through that episode because everybody was all up in their feelings. But as Joe Hortiz was saying, you have to make hard decisions at some point.
And look at that, though. Look at the hard decision he made. You can keep this one player, or you can bring in, I'm just making this number up, 15 players to help build out the underbelly of the roster. Which one of these is the most risky? I'll ask you, Chargers fans, which one of those two options is the riskiest?
That's the other part of this, Dan, is, okay, hard decision in letting go Keenan Allen. So how are you going to go out and combat that? Before the draft took place, actually, I take that back, on Thursday, when the Chargers selected Joe Alt, the wide receivers in that room were Quentin Johnston, Joshua Palmer, Darius Davis, and who?
Semi Fehoko.
That was on Thursday after night one. And in a matter of weeks to the draft, you went out and you drafted 3 wide receivers. Ladd McConkey, Brendan Rice, Cornelius Johnson. You go out and you get DJ Chark in free agency. And all of a sudden, the Chargers have 18 wide receivers, and everybody's telling them to stop signing wide receivers because it's too many.
And oh, by the way, Jake, this was actually one of, I think, lost, but one of the earliest pieces where I'm like, oh, Joe Hortiz gets it. They go sign Joe Alt. Start of the second round. Chargers fans are immediately like, oh my gosh, we need a receiver. Oh no. And then you see the Chargers are trading up. You're like, no, what are they doing? They're losing draft picks. And I remember, Jake, you and I were talking about this. And I think initially you were kind of freaking out because, oh no, here we go. The sneaky part about what Joe Hortiz did was he didn't actually lose draft picks.
Swap.
It was a pick swap. I think you went down roughly 20 spots. You get the guy you want, the same number of draft picks, and you get to lean on your expertise of your GM and the coaching staff that was just in college and knows these guys most. And you get the receiver that you want that best fits this Chargers team. Compare that to the Kenneth Murray trade.
I'd rather not.
Which, by the way, let's not even talk about if Kenneth Murray panned out or not, but you lost a pick, a good pick, to do it. I think it was 3rd round pick, right? I think you gave up second and the third to go up to the first.
Yes.
Woof. So this is the Los Angeles Joe Hortiz, GM, that when we ask, is the GM actually better? You know, in a lot of ways, this is a we'll see discussion, but also in a lot of ways, through 1 year, it is a resounding yes. It is an upgrade. You take a challenging situation from a roster perspective, flip it on its head. You get players, along with your coaching staff, to buy in to the vision of what you've done previously in Baltimore. You then implement that same vision in some of the selections, right? They value and prioritize the trenches. They value and prioritize a balanced offense, protecting the quarterback. Both Baltimore and Michigan prioritized and showcased a defense that was able to impose its will many times. Chargers fans remember that game last year against Baltimore where they got trucked by their defense. You look at the acquisitions that they brought in, the types of deals that they made, the savviness within the draft, letting it fall to them. And it's a miracle, Jake. And it's funny now, hindsight, looking back at Chargers fans, generally speaking. I know there were a lot of people who really wanted Joe Alt for an offensive lineman. But generally speaking, the anxiety of Chargers fans after night one versus the feeling of euphoria after day 3 ended. And everyone essentially was like, take a bow to Joe Hortiz.
It's also, Dan, that you can look at this draft and you look at Joe Alt, Ladd McConkey, and Junior Colson, and without even taking a single snap, you already know that all three of them are going to start.
Yep.
There's no question about that. How many times?
Keep going.
I mean, yes, you could make an argument from the standpoint that, Brendan Rice will be in the mix there for the wide receiver. Kamani Vidal is going to be in the mix for the running back room because it's going to be running back by committee. Time will obviously tell on what Ebogbe, Tarheeb Still, and Cam Hart are going to do. That's only because of who's ahead of them right now in the depth chart and guys who have been here a little bit longer.
Tarheeb Still is doing it. Watch.
But there's not many drafts where you could go back in Tom Telesco's tenure and look at just the first 3 picks and say, that guy's going to come in and immediately contribute. Majority of it was always the first round.
Maybe you could have. Does that? I will ask you though. Is that because of the lack of talent that was on the team, or because of who was selected? I mean, it's probably both.
It's partly both, yes, because you can go back to the Rashawn Slater, Asante Samuel Jr., and then Joshua Palmer. You already knew that Keenan Allen and Mike Williams were going to be ahead of him on the depth chart, but they were going to try to mix him in. That was maybe the one of the few times of Tom Telesco's tenure to where you could look at that and say, all 3 of these guys are going to find a way to contribute. But the rest of the time, it's not pretty. It's not a pretty road to recap when you look at the roster building of the Chargers over the better part of 10 years under the previous regime. The bigger part about this is, Dan, is that we know, specifically more with the Brandon Staley area, that there has been disconnect between GM and head coach. And especially when it came to the draft or certain free agent signings. Organization had organization had one idea, the coach had another, and the two were never to be able to be on the same page. The relationship with Jim Harbaugh and Joe Hortiz has essentially been in lockstep since day one. You look at this roster that they have built through the draft, or even how it's panned out now, and there are fingerprints of both Joe Hortiz and Jim Harbaugh all over this. And everything that both of them said that they wanted to do coming into this organization thus far has happened for the better part. Prioritizing the offensive line, building out depth at certain position, solving roster problems, tight end, subplanning Keenan Allen with 3 wide receivers in the same draft, along with some other free agent signings. This has been a great start and an offseason for Jim Harbaugh and Joe Hortiz. And if this is just step 1 of year 1 of their future together, get ready, because as Joe Hortiz says, they ain't done building. Building a team is constant. It's year-round. So how would you like to see some of those regular season moves for the Chargers, especially if they're in contention for the playoffs?
And oh, by the way, Jake, I think the Chargers are on the hook or scheduled to have at least 3 compensatory picks next year.
Already doing what he said he was going to do. Yes. 5th, 6th, 7th round, whatever it is, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's extra swings at the bat. Or at the plate, excuse me.
According to NFL.com, they're projected to be getting 1 in round 5, 2 in round 6.
I think they still have the J.C. Jackson pick technically in that trade that didn't end up kicking in until 2025, but it's an additional pick that they'll have in the 7th.
So again, a lot of it will be, we'll see, but we are just basing off of what we have seen so far and the savviness of what the new general manager is doing. So I know we went long here, but time will tell, right? Now there is some risk to what Joe Hortiz is doing, and it's not all going to be fixed in 1 year. We've talked about some of the concerns about how much stock they're putting in a lot of these prove-it deals, which I guess you could also argue, but what other options do they have considering the cap constraints they're under?
Correct.
we've wondered, people have talked about, like, do they need kind of that bona fide wide receiver one? Should they have gotten a receiver instead of Joe Alt in round one? All that kind of stuff, right? Like, people are wondering about the Greg Roman offense. People are wondering if this defense can do what it needs to do with Jesse Minter without getting maybe another safety, or if they need more corner. Like, there's still some outstanding things that could possibly derail this team, obviously. But as we snap the line right now on Monday, June 24th, I don't know how Joe Hortiz could have done better. Could he have done a couple things differently? Sure.
Under the circumstances, yes.
So, old versus new. Telesco versus Joe Hortiz. This is a general manager upgrade. Anything else, Jake? I know we went through a lot. We got into the weeds here, but it was important to both you and I to do so to help provide perspective.
Correct.
And specifics.
Yes. Time will tell on it, but early days in a single off season, it's pretty good.
Pretty good. I think that'll do it. Exciting times for Chargers fans. July 16th. We'll be here very soon. Rookies report the 16th. The 23rd is when the veterans report to training camp. Already under a month away, and we will have a ton of coverage. Some exciting things planned for that. But we have more storylines to come as the weeks progress between now and then. But until then, for Jake Hefner, you can find him at Jake T. Hefner. I'm Dan, Chargers Unleashed, LA Football Network. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. We'll talk to you next time on Chargers Unleashed. Have a great week, and we will talk to y'all soon.